King, comfort of the Spirit, true to give word, President, full of all things, treasure of blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O God. So basically what I'd like to do is finish off with the 20th century tonight, and then we'll talk about what possibilities there are for the next series. I've already got one suggestion from somebody. So basically, we caught up to the beginning of the 20th century, or we're up to the beginning, first 20 years of the 20th century in America. But a lot of the focus of what was going on in the Orthodox world was in Russia. Now, of course, there were the other national churches too, which were all affected by the First World War, some more than others, and then it was, and of course, but in 1917, which was towards the end of the war, was the Russian Revolution happened. And there were two major phases of the Russian Revolution. There was March, where the provisional government was established. The Tsar was forced to abdicate, and he abdicated for himself, his son, and then his brother abdicated, and so there was no longer a house of Romanov house for the imperial authority, and so that ended the monarchy in Russia. At the same time, this provisional government, which was largely socialist, had a combination of some of the old aristocracy, but then the socialists and the Soviets in particular, which had been established over the course of the years, which were basically local councils, were gaining more and more power within the cities. The people were organized by socialist organizers, political organizers, and they saw to it that their people were elected, and so there was a democratic element in all of this, but it basically culminated in a fairly small group of people, the Bolsheviks, overthrowing the provisional government at the end of October in 1917. In the meantime, starting in May, there had been the Great Council of the Russian Church, which was quite a remarkable event that had been under preparation for many years. The 1905 revolution basically put it on hold, and it had some rather interesting agendas, and one of which was the election of a patriarch, which was the first time the patriarch could be restored because the Romanov dynasty had fallen.
What's the relation?
Basically, during the entire Romanov period, from Peter I onward, the czars had abolished the patriarchate and submitted the church to a lay bureaucrat called an overprocurator, and who actually oversaw the life of the church, and essentially chaired the synod, the Holy Synod. A very uncanonical order. A Lutheran order, actually, is where he got it from. But it was but basically from, I think, about 1720 all the way up until 1917. And then the patriarchate was restored, and Tikhon was elected patriarch. The other major candidate was Anthony Khrapovitsky, who actually had been the one who had been was the favored candidate, but because the election of the patriarch was handled by putting the three names. There was still a third candidate who I don't know what was. Putting the three names into a chalice, and a blind elder drew the name out of the chalice.
And the government at that time didn't have anything against it?
The provisional government was not substantially anti-church. There were socialists, but Lenin and his party had not really come to power. And they weren't exactly enthusiastic, pious Orthodox. But at that time, and also from the late 19th century on, there had been these very strong waves of secularism affecting Russia. The aristocracy, starting in the 18th century, was alienated from the church. They were even alienated from Russian culture to a great extent. They spoke French among themselves. They spent large amounts of time in the West, and they lived as bourgeois Western aristocrats, and couldn't really be bothered with all this retrograde Orthodox Church stuff. Now, the intelligentsia, on the other hand, part of the intelligentsia had started turning back towards the church at the beginning of the 20th century. And that was the continuation of the Slavophile movement. But then there was another very large part of the intelligentsia, who were like, the poor intelligentsia, who were profoundly alienated. It included many Jews, but was not exclusively Jewish by any means. It included a lot of the freed serfs, and those who were who were struggling to make it in the new urban context. Basically, it was a huge shock to the system for most of Russia to go through the kind of rapid industrialization that happened at the end of the 19th century. And as a result, it created all sorts of political turmoil. There was also tremendous poverty and tremendous amounts of suffering as a result of this swift urbanization, this swift industrialization. Nobody cared for the rights of workers. There was child labor. There were all sorts of abuses, and so it was ripe for the socialist, communist organizers who proclaimed to have the rights of the working people, the proletariat, as their first and greatest concern. It was a workers' revolution, but it was completely controlled by the communists. And in fact, one of the interesting points of the ideology is that there was a division in the pre-revolutionary communist dialogue going on between the various segments of the Communist Party, one of which was led by Lenin, and Trotsky was a leader in the other party. Lenin wanted everything centralized in one person. For the others, they wanted it on a much more democratic kind of arrangement. Obviously, Lenin won out. So 1917 in October, there were a lot of things going on. The council, the restoration of the Patriarchate, was a landmark event. There were also there was also a very progressive element. being pushed by a certain a progressive agenda being pushed by a certain group within the church, theology professors and generally the white clergy, which eventually took shape in the living church. But for example, the Russian church voted in the new calendar. They voted in certain kinds of ecclesiastical reforms. They even voted in to translate the services into the Russian language. All of those reforms essentially got shelved with the revolution, where the church was basically thrown back into a very conservative mode. And it wasn't long after Patriarch Tikhon was elected that the October Revolution happened. So he barely had a chance to get his feet on the ground as the patriarch. And soon after the revolution, the clergy started being shot by the communists. Father John Kachurov, one of the first.
What is your opinion about the calendar? Don't you think we should have all the same one?
I think it needs to be a universal decision of the church, and not just individual patriarchates or churches.
Yeah, but most of them are not in the old calendar.
Most of them are.
Or you are talking
Most
because Russia is by numbers.
Russia is more than half the church, more than half the Orthodox Church, and so about 2/3 of the Orthodox Church follows the old calendar.
Didn't know that.
Basically, the churches that follow the Greeks are on the new calendar.
But the Greeks are on the new calendar.
The Greeks are on the new calendar. Now, I think last time I mentioned Meletios Metexakis, who convened a council in 1923. That was when, so this was 5 years after the Russian Great Council. And that's when the Greeks adopted the new calendar. So the Russians actually preceded them in that, yeah.
Question on that. To me, the proof of the calendar starts with the holy fire. I don't know how you argue with that in any way, shape, or form. And it doesn't care what your emotional feelings are. It doesn't care what your industrial feelings are. It doesn't care what your scholarly feelings are or the history of anything. It's the fact that the holy fire actually happens, and it actually happens on the old Orthodox Easter.
Right.
That's it. To me, it's done. I don't get all the other positions.
Yeah,
And I hate the fact that every church I ever belonged to never even knew about it.
There's also old calendar theophany, where the waters in the Jordan move backwards on old calendar theophany.
Really?
That I
Doesn't happen on new calendar theophany.
Wow.
Wow.
I didn't know
You
that.
can see it on YouTube. You see the waters move.
Do we need like one more point just to like put the nail in the coffin for them? I mean, I don't get it.
Yeah, the problem is that the spring equinox is supposed to happen on March 21st.
There is another one.
It actually, and now this century it's happening on March 8th. The next century it'll be on March 7th. The next century after that it'll be March 6th. So it's a fixed astrological event.
yeah, but you cannot
That's the
say
problem. That's the problem.
That, you cannot say that the holy fire is more important than the resurrection.
And quite frankly, we can celebrate the resurrection, and we do celebrate it every Sunday. And you can
Yeah.
celebrate the resurrection, and we do every day of the week,
Yes.
any day of the week, any day of the year.
Yeah, but the holy fire is coincide with the Easter,
Right.
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So sometimes I've been to Jerusalem
Mhm.
when it happens, and for me sometimes it seems that the Holy Fire is more important than the resurrection itself.
That can happen in popular piety, and the resurrection is the essence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be.
Yeah. So now, if the whole church elected to change how Pascha was calculated, my guess is that the Holy Fire would come on whenever the Orthodox, whenever the patriarch goes into the tomb of Christ and prays the prayers to ask God to send down the Holy Fire.
He comes out with it.
Right. Because the patriarch doesn't do that for the new calendar feast.
No, he
That's
doesn't.
right.
So, yeah. So, I'm just saying. So, 1917, the council, there were many people from North America. We talked about that, how a lot of the leaders of the North American church got stuck in Moscow. And basically all hell was breaking loose because it was not only revolution, but it was the beginning of the Russian Civil War, which essentially continued on through 1922. And there were two major factions, the Reds, the Communists, and then there were the Whites, who were those who remained faithful to the monarchy, those who remained faithful to the old regime, and a lot of the aristocracy, a lot of the military formed into the White Army. In the meantime, there were thousands of refugees, and the aristocracy in particular fled. And part of the reason is that they had by far the most to lose. I knew one, he was an old priest monk, Father Andrei Urusov, who was quite a character. But when he was a little boy in 1917, he was like 8, he and his brother and their whole family were hauled out of their villa in Moscow. His parents and uncles were all shot in front of him, in front of the children, and the children were put on a train to Belgium, where they were raised in a Catholic orphanage. The aristocracy in particular were targets of the Bolsheviks, and it was a brutal time, and there was enough anger and hatred built up that it not only against the Bolsheviks but against the church, and so they started desecrating churches and slaughtering clergy and monks and nuns. All this went on until 1922. Most of the refugees had fled in the late teens, and in 1922, the remnants of the White Army took refuge in the West as well, or in China. And so there was a huge Russian contingent in China, in Manchuria, in Harbin, and in Shanghai, which had a massive international community. A lot of the other refugees went to Paris and Western Europe in general. Many went to Serbia. Some went to Constantinople, and then from Constantinople to Serbia. And there they organized the Russian Orthodox Church in exile under the leadership of Metropolitan Anthony Khrepovitsky. Back in Moscow, St. Tikhon, the patriarch, was alternately in and out of jail and in and out of house arrest, mostly under house arrest. And in 1924, he issues his famous ukaz telling the external dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church to organize their own lives And that was the kind of charter for the Russian Orthodox Church abroad to order itself and to set up an administration, so that it became the highest church administration for the Russian Orthodox. And this was all done with the blessing and the support of the Serbian Orthodox Patriarch. There's been a long brotherly relationship between the Russians and the Serbs. In Russia, 1924, Lenin dies. 1925, on Annunciation, Patriarch Tikhon died, likely poisoned. Just previous to that, his cell attendant, by the name of Yakov, was shot on the stairs going up to the Patriarch's apartment. And so the two of them were actually buried very close together. Yakov on the outside of the wall, and St. Tikhon on the inside of the wall. But St. Tikhon was way down underneath the 17th century heating system of the church where he was buried at Donskoy Monastery, so that they couldn't find and desecrate his relics. They were only finally found about 1992 or thereabouts, and are still reposing in Donskoy Monastery in the middle of Moscow. One of the next major things that happened was the Bolsheviks were trying to consolidate power, consolidate their authority over the entire country. Of course, it was a huge country to do that in, and that included purges of their own people that they didn't consider ideologically pure. Now, it was also explained to me when I was living in Russia that the first 10 years of Soviet power, starting with Lenin and then up until about 1927, were largely under the control of, where the Bolsheviks in control were largely Jews. And there was a reaction to that. But part of the reaction was occasioned by an absolute licentiousness that prevailed. Part of the socialist program is to destroy the family, to destroy the church, to destroy anything that gives identity other than the state. And so the destruction of marriage, homosexuality, abortion, all of these things, the equivalence, not just equality, but equivalence between men and women, are all part of that agenda to erase the old culture and to root people solely in dependence on the state as the source of all of life. And so this period of the 20s was a time when all of the prohibitions and the taboos, all of the basic Christian morality was lifted, and people just were engaged in all sorts of promiscuity, all sorts of all sorts of violence, all sorts of crime, and of course the crime would have been against those bourgeois enemies of the state. And so eventually, there was a Russian nationalist reaction. And so starting in 1927 and culminating in 1937, there was an immense purge of the Jews from the Communist Party. And this was also the time when Stalin was consolidating his authority. Now, already under Lenin, and the Soviets tried to paint Lenin as really a good guy. He was, like Uncle Vlad, kind of thing. That everybody, yeah.
He's our dedos.
But in reality, he was a bloodthirsty tyrant, and it's interesting to read in some of his letters, which drip with hatred.
Wow.
They drip with hatred for the church, for Christians, for anything holy. So the destruction of churches and the arrest and murder of clergy began to accelerate under Lenin, and then continued to accelerate all the way up into the 30s. It was a brutal time, and many church properties were confiscated. Most of the church properties were confiscated. Monasteries were confiscated and closed. The monks and the nuns were either sent to Siberia. Some were sent just back into the world, and many were just shot. And so if you go to the Alexander Nevsky Lavra, into the cemetery, which is a huge part of the yard around the Lavra, you can see the wall where the last monks of the Lavra were lined up against and shot. And the bullet holes are still there in the mortar, or in the stucco of the building. They also tortured people. There was another grave in the cemetery this was over near St. Zenya, where 42 people, priests, deacons, monks, and nuns, were burned. Well, they were burned on top of that, and then buried alive while they were being burned.
Wow.
Yeah. And there was a plaque on the grave with a quote from the Book of Revelation. These are those who have washed their garments in the blood of the Lamb, and now stand before the throne of God day and night. The church was in, obviously it was in shock. There was another aspect to the persecution which they used. Now in the late, starting in the 20s and then going on, was the confiscation of church valuables. So especially all the metal, the silver, the gold, in other words, the chalices, all the vessels, the oclades on the icons, everything that could be melted down and sold. The jewels, and there were a great many jewels on the vessels and embedded into the icons and things. These were all taken and it was sold, or prepared to be sold. And this included national treasures such as all the historical museums of the Kremlin and things like that. Now, the Hillwood Museum, which is just over that way? Yeah. Anyway, not too far from here, has a large collection of that stuff. But right now it's not really politically correct to be overly focused on Russia, so they're not really interested in that. They're more interested in, you know, pretty patterns of China.
It's called the Hillwood?
Hillwood.
Hillwood.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. Marilyn can tell you all about it.
Okay.
Yeah, you should go there.
Yeah, it's worth seeing.
It is.
They do have a tiny little bit of their ecclesiastical collection. And one thing, there's one piece that'll just kind of give you an image of the kind of treasures that the church, well, it's not the church, that Russia, undoubtedly the Tsar, possessed, was a chalice completely covered with diamonds. I don't know how many millions of dollars that thing is worth, but it's just unbelievable. And then, you know, the vestments, you know, would be covered with jewels. You know, the cloth would be made of gold. So it was It's the kind of stuff that you can't get in a democracy. It's the kind of stuff that they would, you know, the churches that they built and how they furnished and decorated, you'll never find in a democracy.
Right.
You know, this is about as good as it gets, and it's mostly acrylic paint. you know, here, in reality. I mean, it's gorgeous, fantastic, but it's acrylic paint.
There is some gold, I know.
Yeah, there's a little bit.
Gold.
There's a little bit.
Even myself, I know.
There's a little bit.
That chalice, though, if I can just say a word about it, at Hillwood, first of all, it's a miracle that it survived because it's a gold chalice and it's covered with 1,500 small diamonds. It was part of a liturgical set that was given by Catherine the Great. She commissioned this to be given to the Alexander Nevsky Lavra in memory of Potemkin after his death.
How did it end up here? Do you
It
know?
survived not being melted down as all the other valuables were,
Yes.
and was somehow made it to the auction market. Mrs. Post bought it in the West in 1960, I believe.
And it's on display. You can
Yes,
see it.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a real star piece there.
It's probably one of the most valuable things that they have.
Oh, I think so. Very good.
Yeah, it's worth it. And that alone is worth going to see. But the mansion is amazing. And the gardens are great. And go into the greenhouse.
This
That's
is
you.
Mary with a
With
post.
200 orchids.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Don't forget the Fabergé.
Oh, yes, the Fabergé. 2 imperial eggs and some other wonderful pieces.
Yeah. So, so the church goods were confiscated in the name of giving to people in need. However, nobody ever saw the proceeds from any of that, and right into the Bolshevik hands. The communists had, you know, they soon learned that no matter how rich people were, when you take everything from them, they're just more poor people. And, so.
But the confiscation of these valuables resulted in some very prominent martyr saints,
Yeah.
bishops, and even priests who refused to give these up, and so they were shot. Metropolitan Benjamin of St. Petersburg, one of the major ones.
Yeah.
Others.
Another aspect of the Bolshevik persecution, not so much of the church, but as part of their domination of society, was the Holodomor. I don't remember the dates exactly. I think it was late 20s, early 30s.
What was it?
The Holodomor, the
There
Ukrainian
was no
famine.
food.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, right, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
book of Grossman who described
Right.
this whole.
Let me get dates on that exactly.
This is Grossman's book.
Yes,
Oh,
Grossman.
okay.
How is that pronounced?
Holodomor. means they make your powder artificial.
Yeah.
Okay, 1932 and 1933.
Yeah, 30s, yes.
Yeah.
It killed about 12 million people.
Yeah.
All the food that was raised in Ukraine was confiscated, and the people were left with nothing. And it was an entirely fabricated
Yeah.
reality thing. It was created by Stalin, and it was a way of subduing the peasants. But it subdued them very well because it killed them, most of them, or many of them. And so it was a very, I have to say, it was certainly a kind of genocide.
Mm-hmm.
A kind of a genocide.
But that's what would have planted the seed of hate to when the Germans entered, they all took on the German uniform to fight the Russians.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Well, I mean, a lot of people, there wasn't, Ukraine was in 1917, 1918, Ukraine was given independence for a year or two. And then it was simply swallowed up into the Soviet Union, where the republics became more like American states. I mean, they were just part of the same country. And there was free passage between them, and for those who could travel, which was few and far between.
They didn't have their own law like you have them here in different states. It was unified.
Everything
was
was
just called Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, but there wasn't, the money was the same, everything was the same.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and same army,
unified, yeah.
same
army.
party.
Yeah.
Everything's the same.
So it was a tremendously bloody thing. That the St. Tikhon University in Moscow, which formed after after Russia threw off the Soviet yoke, has specialized in collecting all of the information on the new martyrs, especially the clergy. And they have full records on the martyrdoms, including the transcripts of the trials and the records of the executions of 200,000 clergy.
They were thinking it was closer to 300 though total.
Well, clergy, I don't know how many clergy there. 300,000 is that's a lot.
Yeah, that's the figure I've heard in the past.
Yeah, that's possible.
But
Nobody
they
really
documented-
knows.
They documented 200,000. Okay.
Yeah. All told, probably 20 million people were martyred for the sake of Christ by the communists. So,
It's incredible.
yeah, it's unbelievable. What I mentioned, I think, the book Father Arseny, which is really, really worthwhile. He was a priest monk at the Danilov Monastery, which is a monastery right in the middle of Moscow, and a father confessor, and he was seized and thrown into the Gulag in 1927. He didn't emerge until 30 years later. And it was a miracle that he survived. There's a book out, Father Arseny, which is essentially his memoirs. And then there's a second volume, which are the memoirs of his spiritual children. But he emerged profoundly transformed. As they closed the monasteries and banished the monks and nuns, the Soviets, being resourceful people as it were, decided to use them as prisons. And so one of the monasteries they used as a prison was Solov Key. Now, Solov Key is way above the Arctic Circle on an island in the White Sea. In the summertime, it's beautiful. White day, white nights and the whole thing. The sun never goes down for weeks on end. And then in the winter, the sun never comes up for weeks on end. And it's rather chilly, to say the least. So much so that the White Sea freezes. And for the ocean to freeze, salt water to freeze, it has to be really, really cold. There was an elder that I knew in California who also in the 20s was put into Solov Key. Though he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a monk, and in fact he wasn't even a baptized Christian. But he had committed the grave transgression of acquiring a Bible. And he was a med student in Moscow. He'd been raised in an atheist family, but he was kind of curious as to why Christianity was so evil and why it was, the enemy of the people and enemy of the state and all of these kinds of things. And so he somehow got a hold of a Bible. He kept it taped to the underside of a drawer. But his roommate somehow found it and turned him in. And so this kid basically, of course, for us here, medical school is graduate school. In Russia, it's undergraduate. So here's this kid, 20 years old or whatever, thrown into the gulag with all of these priests and bishops and monks and nuns. And other religious as well. And so the first people that he met were Lutherans, actually. But they said, "Oh, you're Russian. You should go to the Russians. Go to the Russian bishops." And so he was catechized and baptized in Solov Key. They would have they would collect the crumbs from their bread rations. And they would collect berries and make wine, as it were, however it was, and serve the Eucharist. But of course, they didn't have all the trappings of a temple, and they didn't necessarily have an antimens, with the relics of a saint. So what they would do is they would have one of their fellow prisoners lay down, because he was soon to die anyway, and they would celebrate the Eucharist on his chest.
Wow.
Yeah. Quite an introduction to Orthodoxy, if you can only imagine, being taught by saints and martyrs. Because he wasn't one of these, leaders of the church and enemies of the state and enemies of the people. There was a difference in how he was treated. They fed him. Unlike the others, who basically would last about 3 weeks doing hard labor, logging, and then they would simply fall in the forest and would be shot where they fell. And so winter rolled around and there was less to do outside. It's hard to do much at 60 below zero. He had a buddy whose name was Peter. And the two of them decided to escape. And so they made skis. In the Arctic night, midwinter, of course, they walked south. And so they made it across the White Sea, and they made it up into the land, and they made it about 400 miles. And then they're not quite 400 miles. And then they came and they saw a village in the distance glowing with electric lights. And that night, his buddy died of exposure. and Father Dimitri thought, oh, all is lost, you know. They'll seize me and put me back in the Gulag. So he went back. He retraced his steps and walked back. You know, and this is all in the Arctic night. And so he got back, and the other prisoners were rather surprised to see him. And they said to him, "You fool, there's no electricity in that part of Russia. You'd made it to Finland."
Oh, wow.
So basically, and of course they didn't feed him after that. So basically he turned around and he left again, and he retraced his steps and kept going. And he walked to Valam. I don't know how many hundreds of miles. And his friend's greatest desire in life was to become a monk at Valam. And so he decided to live his friend's life for him. And so he became a novice, and this was already in the 30s. And so he lived as a novice at Valam, which was in Finland at the time, because the Winter War of 1940 had not happened yet. And so he was there for a while, and it became obvious that the situation was deteriorating. And so he left and he went to Paris. And then, but in the meantime, while he was at Valam, he had a buddy by the name of Leonid, who later became Father Mark. And Leonid was the monastery joker. And there's all sorts of wonderful stories. And Leonid became not only Father Mark, but then he became Bishop Mark. And he was the last Moscow Patriarch and Bishop of San Francisco, consecrated in 1969. And I had a chance to get to know him very well. And his buddy, he summoned his buddy, Father Dimitri now, who had spent the war in Paris, who had been tantred a monk and ordained a priest, had gone to Saint-Serge, finished his theological studies. And then he came to America as a missionary. And so the two of them came as missionaries from the Finnish church to the Americans. I can pick up later on the story of Father Dimitri. But he, well, I'll just, anyway, so they were at Holy Trinity Cathedral in San Francisco, in the Metropolia. There was a third priest who was a married priest and who had been part of the Pskov mission. Now, the Pskov mission was basically composed of a number of Latvian priests who followed the victorious troops of the Third Reich into Russia as Russia banished the communists, and they opened churches, because under the Nazis the church was free to operate. So, the Pskov mission is very interesting. There's a movie called Pope, which is about the Pskov, priest from the Pskov mission. That's on YouTube. It's Pope. Pope.
It means priest.
It means priest in Russian.
Oh,
It's a kind of slang term for priest.
just P-O-P?
P.O.P.
So, with a hieromonk from Valam and another hieromonk who had been at Valam, who do you think had the longer confession lines at the cathedral? It wasn't the married priest. And so the married priest got jealous, and so the situation became kind of toxic. And so one day, Father Dimitri, who is his name, disappeared. And he was found camping in the woods in Point Reyes on a piece of land that had been given to the church by a family whose son had been killed in the last days of World War II. It was like 3 days before the end of the war. So they gave the church their vacation budget, basically. Well, Father Dimitri ended up getting a blessing, and he established St. Eugene's Hermitage. The boy's name had been Eugene. So they named it after him, and Father Dimitri lived there for the next 17 years as a hermit, all by himself. And then the the bishop decides to make him a parish priest, going from hermit to parish priest. Not a great thing.
Wow.
So he did that for a while, and the hermitage stayed empty. And then in the mid-70s, he became ill and was recovering at the monastery of the Assumption in Napa Valley in Calistoga, and a number of nuns began to gather around him. And so he purchased a house in Santa Rosa, which would then become the Our Lady of Kazan Skeet. He died finally, I think, in 1992. Yeah, 92. But the Skeet is a remarkable place of Russian piety, with all American nuns. But with a deep, authentic Russian piety. Anyway, so that kind of personalizes some of this history. It happens to be St. Eugene's Hermitage in Point Reyes, where I was for 10 years, that start the monastery of St. John in San Francisco. So that's kind of the connection. So 1937 was kind of the peak of the brutality of the Soviet regime. If you also remember, 1937 was the year that the church in Russia sent a bishop to America to try and bring the American churches into line back under the American patriarch, back under the Moscow patriarchate, because there was no patriarch. They were requiring an oath of loyalty to the Soviet government. So you can't imagine, there weren't too many Americans who were, or much less Russian immigrants, who were interested in a loyalty oath to the Soviet government. There were a few that did, and that formed the foundation of the parishes of the Moscow Patriarchate, which is one of the 3 Russian jurisdictions. ROCOR was, and the OCA were united at the time, up until 1946, and both of them were in opposition to the Moscow Patriarchate, because it was obviously controlled by communists. Meanwhile, back in Russia, starting in the mid-20s, Saint Tikhon died in 1925. He left a will with a designated successor, who was quickly seized and, I think, shot. And his designated successor, or the one after that, I don't remember which, was Sergiy Strogorodsky. And so around 1926, you have Metropolitan Sergius as the locum tenens of the Patriarchal See. Now, there was no possibility to convene a council for the election of the Patriarch, because almost all the bishops were in jail or had been shot. And during this same time, the Soviet government had sponsored a church called the Living Church, and it was composed of these progressive churchmen who had were frustrated by the 1917 Council and who liked the Soviets and who basically wanted to do a radical reform of Orthodoxy. So, for example, they got rid of the iconostas, they pulled the altar out into the center of the church, they got rid of monks, they had married, their bishops were married, all sorts of reforms, which are echoed now under Mr. Denisenko in the Kievan Patriarchate. You know, Russian language services and new calendar and all of this, you know, clean-shaven priests and so forth. All sorts of abominations like that. The Living Church was a it attracted a lot, you know, liberal clergy who were willing to compromise themselves to with the Soviet government and just accepted the Soviet power or even supported it. And they also were declared as the official Russian Orthodox Church, the state-recognized church. Now, that seems very odd for the Soviet government to officially recognize the church. However, the official state-recognized church is what owned all the property. And so, for the state to recognize the church means that that body had the right to all the properties. Not just in Russia, but abroad. And so they sent over a bishop, so-called, to America with all of the official papers that he was the official representative of the official state-recognized church, that the previous church regime was no longer recognized. In other words, Patriarch Tikhon, and the church of the old regime. And so they started seizing properties in America. And this, of course, had a huge effect, because in normal Orthodox fashion, all properties were held in the name of the bishop. So that changed very quickly, and churches, most of the churches were able to reincorporate. And so that's the reason why in some Russian Orthodox churches you'll find a clause in their bylaws saying no bishop has any authority over this church. Which has turned out to be very problematic in very many cases. But what it did is that it saved the church from being seized by the Living Church. Unfortunately, St. Tikhon's Cathedral in New York was seized by the Living Church and held by them for many years, until it was finally returned to the Moscow Patriarchate. And I'm sure, and I believe there was a tremendous amount of litigation.
When did it end, this Living Church?
Basically, what I'm getting to. In 1927, Sergius, as the locum tenens of the Patriarchal See, decided to sign an edict essentially declaring peace and recognizing the Soviet government as the legitimate government of Russia. Now, so far as the exiled churches went, that basically damned him forever. But what it did was it brought about a working relationship with the Soviet government. Up until this point, the Soviet government simply just persecuted the church, and now it began to be able to recognize the church as a, because it was still the largest organization in the country, as a...
But Sergius was a patriarch?
Eventually he became patriarch.
So it's Moscow Patriarchate anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no kind of a difference. It's
But there
the
was no
same
patriarch
Yeah, but
at this
when-
time.
Between Tikhon and Sergius,
Right.
there was nobody.
Nobody. Only locum tenens.
Okay.
So, for example, one of the reasons that that Rokor remained in such isolation from the Russian Orthodox Church was because of it accused the Russian Orthodox, the Church in Russia, of Sergianism. In other words, submission to the communist authorities, to the godless authorities. So, unfortunately, it didn't stop the persecutions at all. But the attitude towards the living church lessened, or the government's favor of the living church lessened, and they began to favor Sergius and the canonical Russian Orthodox Church. Now, in 1920, so the living church actually started very early in the 20s, or like around 1921, 22. By 1923, when Patriarch Meletios Metixakis of Constantinople convened a council, a fateful council, which is the one that changed the calendar for the Greek churches and lessened the discipline on the clergy in regards to marriage. Constantinople officially recognized the living church as the true Russian Orthodox Church, and did not recognize Tikhon. So this fight that's going on right now between Constantinople and Moscow, it's been going on for 100 years, basically, or almost 100 years. And it's pretty brutal. So anyway, going into, this all makes sense. There's lots of different things that happened in the up until this Second World War. Also, in 1917, Lenin signed independence for Finland. And so Lenin gave Finland independence as a country. It had simply been a province of the Russian Empire. But Finland was much larger than it is now. And one of the first strokes of World War II in Russia was the Russo-Finnish War, or the Soviet-Finnish War, the Winter War, 1939-1940, in which Russia took most of Karelia. In other words, they pushed the border much farther north. And part of it was the assertion that they couldn't defend St. Petersburg with the previous border, but basically they just took more territory from Finland. Unfortunately, Valon Monastery, which sits on an island in Lake Ladoga, had been in Finland before the war and found itself in the Soviet Union by the end of the war, and so the monks evacuated it. 250 monks fled to central Finland, where they established New Valamo. And the monastery on the island was left desolate, basically. and the Soviets moved undesirables there. People who had been maimed, wounded, alcoholics, undesirables, to just go and live in the monastic quarters, and of course to die, basically, because it's one of the harshest climates you can imagine. This, of course, proved quite a boon for the Finnish Orthodox Church to have Valon Monastery right in the middle of their territory, instead of way off on an island down to the south. But the monastery did not grow, and the Bishop Mark, who I mentioned, was one of the last of the Brotherhood to be living and to die. And there's only been 2 monks there now since, whereas in 1941 there were 250. So
when the living church died?
it died probably in the early 30s.
When Sergius died? Oh,
Okay, I'm getting there.
okay.
So Sergius remained locum tenens of the Patriarchal See up through the 30s. 1940 was the beginning of World War II, of course. At first, Stalin and Hitler had a non-aggression pact, the pact of friendship. You know, they were both fellow socialists, national socialists versus internationalist socialists, but Nazis and communists are basically 2 sides of the same coin. Then, you know, so Hitler took Poland, and then eventually came the invasion of Russia. Stalin was somewhat taken by surprise. Russia lost something like 30 million people in Hitler's invasion, but Russia also were the ones who who basically conquered Berlin. The Americans only came in at the very end, and they helped from the West, but it was really the Russians who took Berlin. In the meantime, the Russian Church abroad had moved its headquarters from in the late 30s from Stremsky Karlovci to Berlin, and there's some very interesting letters between Metropolitan Anastasi and Der Führer. Yes, so not stuff that is too well publicized. And so, for example, there was a lot of cooperation between the Russian Church abroad and the Third Reich, especially in dealing with the ministering to the Russian refugees in the Pskov mission. All of that was coordinated with the Third Reich, and what they shared was a vehement anti-communist. More on a personal note, my first exposure to the OCA was when I was not even a catechist. I was just inquiring, and after going through several other churches, I called up the OCA church. The starosta answered in Russian and said, and I asked him what time the service was. He said, "Oh, you know Russian, we don't want you," and he hung up. But I went anyway, and it was a nice little church in a bad part of town, and an old Latvian priest, Father Michael Zilneranik, and he said, "Oh, nice Anglican boy, almost Orthodox. Here, come into the altar. I'll show you around." You'd never take non-Orthodox into the altar. It's like, but he was 80 something, and so he has me go into the altar and look around, and so he goes over to the window ledge, and takes up a manuscript, and blows the dust off it, and hands it to me. Says, "Here, very important Orthodox literature. You must read this. This is so important for you to understand." It was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is, does everybody know what that is? It was one of the most potent anti-Semitic propaganda documents ever produced. And he said, "This is absolute truth. Hitler was right."
Oh.
And I thought, oh my God, what if here I'm going into the Russian Orthodox Church, and I've got and there's a Nazi in front of me, and little did I know. But the OCA had a whole bunch of Nazis. But you think about it, if this was back in the 70s, you're dealing with men in their 70s and 80s, or 60s, 70s, and 80s, who had been through the war as adults, and from Eastern Europe. And what are they going to be politically? They're either going to be Nazis or they're going to be communists. One of the two. And I was a kid from San Diego. I had no concept of that. So anyway, that was interesting. And so I joined the Moscow Patriarchal Church with a Mexican priest, which was actually quite wonderful. Anyway, so and Father Michael had also been one of these Pskov Mission Church priests, or Pskov Mission priests. Who had followed the Nazi troops into occupied Russia. About 1941, especially as the tides of the war began to turn against Russia, Stalin began to realize that his policies with the church might not be helping. 1943, 1944, he actually, when Moscow was under siege and St. Petersburg were under siege by the Nazis. Remember, St. Petersburg was under siege for almost 3 years. And Moscow was under siege for, I don't really know how long, a couple of years. He had the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God flown around the city. And that's actually, and the Kazan icon of the Mother of God flown around St. Petersburg. And that was when the tides of the war turned. And so there are people, and I'm sure everybody has seen these pictures of these people in Moscow with icons of Stalin that believe that he repented. But whether he did repent or not is unknown. But he's certainly lessened up on the persecution of the church. He let many prisoners go. He opened thousands of churches. He gave back the Trinity St. Sergius Lavra, and he let the church function normally. Which it did basically until the end of his life, about 1953, 1954. And then Khrushchev, who came in after him, clamped down again and closed even more churches than Stalin had. So the Soviet period was utterly brutal. Another book that is essential reading is The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It was the book that finally brought the Russian intelligentsia or the Soviet intelligentsia to realize that what was actually going on, because it was a kind of unspoken, and that was when it was circulating in Samizdat, in self-publishing.
Yeah, that's huge. It's just type of typing machine.
Well, and it's still
So-
huge.
I just picked
In a
up a
very
copy
thin
at the
paper.
bookstore this weekend.
Mhm.
They have literally the 3 volumes of
Three
that
volumes.
thing.
Yeah.
It's gonna take me a long time.
Well, it's
I must have the abridged version.
yeah,
It's just a punt.
it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. So anyway,
And that was out of Khrushchev, is that?
well, actually, it starts under the time of Stalin, I think.
The
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then
The stories.
yeah, the story, and what it does is it goes. The first volume, anyway. I haven't gotten into the second volume for a long time. I don't remember it. It takes you through the whole process that a person would go through from arrest to the initial interview in the police station, then being sent to all these various levels of the gulag along the way, and the transit. Putting 40 people into a train compartment meant for 4, and in Solovki, one of the things that they did, they had this massive cathedral, right, which was stone, and it's stone floors. And when the heating system was working, it was fine in the winter. Even though it was 60 below outside, it was nice and warm inside. But without the heating system, it was just an icebox. And so what they did is they didn't happen to have any bunks for the prisoners. So the prisoners would lie 3 deep, 4 deep, on top of one another, and it was just known that the one at the bottom would freeze to death that night.
Wow.
Yeah. There's another good movie, Russian movie. I don't remember the name of it, but it's several prisoners escape from a gulag in central Siberia and make their way across the Himalayas into India. So some of the stories are just amazing. Anyway, so Stalin lightened up for a while, let the church operate, and the church was able to consolidate its resources. But it's interesting, there's a quote from a bishop in the 30s. And of course, the bishops, they never knew what was going to come next. They never knew if they were going to be able to go to bed in their own bed, if they were going to be able to wake up in their own room, or be shot in the night, or taken out and sent to the gulag, and not just the bishops, but many of the faithful as well.
There's this knocking at the door at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's when
Yeah.
you might not come back.
Yeah, and but one bishop said he'd never felt such freedom. He didn't have to worry about any real estate. He didn't have to worry about church administration. He didn't have to worry about personnel administration. He could freely, simply be a pastor, because that's all there was. The entire life of the church was otherwise obliterated. It's worth reading some of that literature. There's another book that I would bet is over in the library here called Russia's Catacomb Saints, and that was a very early. It's kind of magenta. That was a very early version that came out, published by the Fathers in Platina. There was, during the 40s, late 40s, the World Council of Churches was formed, and the Russian Church, actually, and most of the Orthodox churches, began to take a very important role in the World Council of Churches in organized ecumenism. And the main reason for that was not because they had any great desire to join with Protestants and Catholics, but it gave them a way to get out of Russia and to let people know the truth. So one of the most important of these people was Archbishop Nicodim of Leningrad, and he was the external affairs officer for the Patriarchate in the 50s and the 60s. Patriarch Kirill was his disciple, and he had the job that Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev has now. Of course, it was rather different in the Soviet era, so he would come to these meetings, which were often held in New York or in London or in the West someplace, and he would give the appropriate Soviet line in public, and so he was deeply criticized as being some kind of a hypocrite and betraying the faithful, because he said, "Oh, everything is fine in Russia. There's no persecution, everything," but he had no choice if he wanted to be able to continue to do this. And then in private, he would, to selected people, he would come and detail all of the persecution that was going on. One of the people that he did this with is Bishop Basil Rodzianko, who is quite a wonderful, remarkable person who had a big influence on, well, both Marilyn and I. And Marilyn was his secretary in the 90s, basically, 80s and 90s, and he was the bishop who sent me to seminary. So I also had a connection with him. But he was a priest in London at the time, and he was working with the BBC doing religious broadcasting to Russia. And he served a Serbian church in London. Long history, he had been in Tito's Gulag, because he was a Russian emigre to Serbia and was ordained in the Serbian church and served Serbian communities. Was thrown into the Gulag by Tito, but was ransomed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so he and his family were able to go and live in England in peace, and he took up religious broadcasting to Russia. And there were literally thousands and thousands of people who converted because of his work. 1978, his wife died. 1980, he was drafted by the OCA to become Bishop of San Francisco, and that lasted for 3 years or thereabouts. And then he came to Washington. He was actually consecrated as Bishop of Washington, and he came back here in 83, 84, and he lived the rest of his life here, continuing his broadcasting ministry. Well, in London, where he'd lived for many years, was where Archbishop Nicodim would come and would essentially just reveal all the persecution, all the trials the church was going through, in a very thorough way, which of course made it to the appropriate other authorities. Now, If you remember, in 1946, there was a fight between the Rocor faction and the Metropolia faction in the Russian Church in the United States. And the two split because the Metropolia faction wanted to reconcile with Moscow. The Rocor faction didn't trust Stalin to let the church alone. And so they didn't want to have anything to do with the Moscow Patriarchate or Patriarch Sergius. In 1943, Patriarch Sergius was finally elected Patriarch. Stalin let a number of bishops out of prison because there were only 4 bishops that were free in 1943. He let a number of others out of prison to come and do the election of a patriarch. And so they elected Sergius, who lived for about 8 months. Then I believe it was Alexei I, and then Pimen, then Alexei II, and now Kirill, since the war. The persecution of the church took a different form under Khrushchev. He used a lot of psychological torture. Of course, lots of imprisonment, gulag, and all of that. But it wasn't quite as overtly brutal as under Stalin. And part of that was because they couldn't get away with it because the West was finding out, and the West was asking about what these people and what was going on with individuals. And so the emigre organizations in Paris, in Washington, I would venture to say centered right here in this parish, and New York and other places were very active in their pursuit. One of the organizations was a committee in defense of persecuted Orthodox Christians.
Right.
That you're involved in.
I was a member. Active member.
So it was a brutal time. 50s, 1946. So there was this split in the church in America between Rocor and the Metropolia. And the Metropolia tried to go back under the Moscow Patriarchate, but then they realized they'd made a mistake, but they'd already burned their bridges with Rocor. So the Metropolia ended up being isolated, canonically isolated from the entire rest of the church. And so it wasn't until in the early 1960s that the Metropolia developed a strong ecumenical presence with in the World Council of Churches, which enabled them to start meeting with Metropolitan Nicodemus. And so they began to negotiate some kind of a restoration of relationship with Metropolitan Nicodemus throughout the 60s. And in 1970, that culminated in the Russian Church granting autocephaly to the OCA. Now that's a huge issue in and of itself. Nobody else really accepted it. The Russian Church granted autocephaly instead of autonomy, with the idea that all the rest of the churches in America could gather themselves together in that autocephalous church, and there would be a united American church. But they weren't interested, and they're still not. And so the Metropolia, the OCA, remained somewhat isolated because while the other jurisdictions in America would acknowledge them, they didn't fully recognize them. They didn't fully recognize their autocephaly. And it was, and that situation remains until now. So in the 1980s, Glasnost happened, which was how would you translate Glasnost?
I don't
It
know.
was kind
There's
of
no real translation
It's
to it.
Openness?
it's like openness.
Yeah,
Openness.
openness is the
Openness.
closest.
Openness in Russian society, Soviet society began, and and there was greater and greater freedom. There was greater openness towards the West, and that ultimately culminated in the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 under Gorbachev. However, in 1988, there was a major event, which was the Millennium Celebration of Orthodoxy in Russia. And a part of the result of the Glasnost was that the church was able to secure from the government permission to have a major celebration, nationwide celebration, and with foreign visitors and the whole bit. And so that happened, and this was at the same time that Reagan was making his overtures to Gorbachev, and so Reagan actually went to Danilov Monastery and was part of this whole thing. Gave a remarkable speech there, and and that kind of represented a real warming of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union for the last 3 years of its existence. And then 1991, you had the final hand on Christmas Day that Gorbachev basically announced the end of Soviet power, and then basically anarchy prevailed. I lived in Russia in 1993, from January through November, and it was there literally was anarchy. It was basically people. It was city-states essentially, with no central government, and things worked actually pretty well. But
It was Yeltsin at that time. Who was
it was Yeltsin.
Yeltsin.
Then in August of 1993 was the attempted coup, and they shot up their own parliament building. 1,800 people officially died in that, and that was it signaled a kind of a major shift, and Yeltsin took much greater authority. Of course, we now know that Yeltsin. This was an American-sponsored color revolution, with the intention of looting Russia's resources, which they did. And then in 1998, the economy collapsed. All the banks collapsed. But in the meantime, and so Russia spent the 90s in a profound depression. And the oligarchs were seizing properties, and people, apartments were being privatized, and people were selling their apartments and finding themselves not having any place to live, and and things just became chaos. In the meantime, though, the church seized every opportunity that it could possibly get to begin to restore its life. One of the interesting examples of that is the Brotherhood of the All-Merciful Savior in Moscow. It was centered at the Church of St. Nicholas on Novokuznetsky, and it was I can't remember the name of the priest. It was a German name. This old priest who, during the last decades of the Soviet Union, was nurturing young men in their vocations to serve the church. But it was, at that time, it was forbidden for Muscovites to go to seminary. They would only take kids from the far provinces. So there were a huge number of kids who came from Western Ukraine, around Počajev Monastery, and then there were people from all over the southern, the stands. And part of it was that they didn't want any Moscow intellectuals, to be, involved in this religion stuff. Well, they were, and the people were very, and there were, even though there remained only 5,000 churches open in the country at the end of the Soviet period, for 300 million people, there was a core group of faithful that was very, very strong, and in Moscow there was a very strong contingent of these. Well, it became obvious that these young men couldn't go right into the seminary. So the priest there at St. Nicholas encouraged them to go and get doctorates and degrees in all the various secular scientific professions, and to raise themselves up to the top of their fields. So this was going on through the 70s and the 80s. And so by the 90s, there was this whole cadre of pious, faithful, highly educated, very well-placed men who came together, who were ordained, and they started seizing properties. Of course, it was all state property, right? But they started seizing the old churches and started restoring them and organizing people, and then they organized the St. Tikhon. Well, it became, when I was teaching there, it was the St. Tikhon Institute in 1993, and then it became the St. Tikhon Humanitarian University or something like that. And there were several of these organized just within Moscow itself, not to mention everywhere else in the country, the same thing going on. And the life of the church was booming. Monasteries were being returned to the church, and young people were flocking to the monasteries. In 1993, there were 50,000 people living in the monasteries. They'd been open for 3 years, 2 or 3 years, 50,000. Of course, they were just total novices. They had no clue, but there's something in Russian culture that people kind of have an idea what monastic life is supposed to look like. We don't have that in our culture, but in Russian culture it's there, kind of buried. Now, very few of those people actually lasted, and so there was in the first part of the 2000s there was a kind of falling away of because the initial zeal had kind of faded, but the core remained, and so there's now 1,000 monasteries in Russia. They've been building 3 churches and consecrating 3 churches a day for the past 30 years. In Moscow, there's now about 800 churches. Problem is, there's about 20 million people in Moscow. So try and figure out how many people you can cram into 800 churches. maybe 40,000, 50,000. I mean, maybe you can get more. Maybe you can get 100,000 people into those 800 churches. Some of them are very big. And then they rebuilt Christ the Savior Cathedral. Stalin blew it up in 1937. It had been one of the great landmarks of Moscow. It had been built by collections taken from the common people as a war memorial, and of course that wasn't respected, and so. But it was rebuilt by the city of Moscow over a period of 3 years, and the cost of $4 billion. An exact replica of what had been blown up.
Wow.
Only this time it had 4 stories of underground parking. But what's interesting is, on that site, Stalin had wanted to erect a building of Soviets with this massive statue of Lenin, a couple 100 feet tall or something like that. But every time they tried to do the excavation for the building, it was hopeless because it was swampy riverside property. So they ended up scrapping the idea for the building and just building a swimming pool in the foundations of the old church. Now the church sits there without any problem. So, of course, modern engineering. And it's all over Russia. In the Far East, there were cities, Magadan among others, which had never had any churches because they were founded by prisoners from the gulags. And so the church undertook to missionize these cities to establish churches and dioceses and the whole organization of the church. And so now it's this incredible renaissance of the Orthodox Church that has happened in Russia. And 1985, no one would have dreamed such a thing would have happened, or could have happened. Back on the other side of the pond, in New York, the ROCOR was headed by Metropolitan Loris, and he was the first of the metropolitans of the Russian Church abroad to be open to the idea of reconciliation with Moscow. And so discussions began, and in the year 2007, there was actually at the encouragement of President Putin, ROCOR reconciled with Moscow. But it wasn't until 2010 that ROCOR reconciled with the OCA. And I had a hand in that, shall we say. A great mistake. It would have been much easier for me if they hadn't. If we hadn't done it. Anyway. Let's see. So, there's infinite amounts of more detail that could be gone into, but those are kind of the broadest strokes. At some point, we could talk about the what's going on right now with Ukraine and all of that, but not on camera.
We could do that when you get back.
Yeah, well, we'll know more by that time. Yeah.
Can I ask a couple of questions? Constantinople recognized, was it the Living Church?
Right.
Which has continued on. And is
But then the Living Church died off, and then they recognized the Moscow Patriarchate.
is the Pskov mission part of the monastery? Is it from the monastery?
No, Pskov Mission was actually a program of ROCOR in collaboration with the Third Reich.
Okay. So it had nothing to do with the,
Pskov Monastery?
yeah.
No, Pskov Monastery was actually, I'm not sure. I think during the war, the Pskov Monastery was actually in
Estonia.
Estonia.
Yeah.
It was always abroad.
And now it's
No,
in
you know,
Russia.
the borders, went back and forth and back and forth. I love the story of the one abbot of the Pskov Caves Monastery. The Soviets wanted to close it, and so the abbot and all the senior monks put on all their medals, their war medals, from the Second World War, because they were all decorated veterans. And the abbot went out and stood in front of the monastery and said, "And who are you going to take this monastery from? Defenders of the fatherland?" And so the communists went away. Unfortunately, that didn't repeat itself too often in Russian history. So there's a story about an abbess who did that too, and that wasn't because she was a decorated veteran. It was because she was so strong that nobody would quarrel with her. Even the communists were afraid of her.
Does history view Sergius in a positive or negative way, or just as a...
There is different opinions.
Absolutely.
Right.
It depends on who you are.
Right.
Okay. Well, how do you view it then?
I don't know.
How do you view it?
How do I view it?
Yeah. Was he...
I think he was in an impossible situation.
Yes.
Mhm.
He's accused of having sold out people, and individuals, and turned them over to the Soviet authorities to their death. I don't know, but I don't think that we can stand in judgment, because we couldn't even imagine that kind of pressure. So. Or that kind of situation. Saint Tikhon Saint Tikhon never compromised, and of the hundreds of thousands of martyrs who were actually canonized, there's another 5 times that number of martyrs who are not canonized, and the reason for that, for some of them, not all of them by any means, but for some of them, is because they broke under torture. And some of them betrayed others. So. Anything else? It's a remarkable history. And it's well worth researching. So now I'd said that there's going to be a 3-week break. There is a possibility that I'll have to put off my trip next week. So check your email. if you want to meet next week, or if you just want to take a break. What do you think?
If you're here, let's meet.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. But check your email and I'll try and let people know by. You know.
Maybe you want a break from us.
I'm enjoying it. I enjoy this a lot. And besides, we didn't have a chance to talk about either the current situation with the other churches, or much less what we're going to talk about next. Ioannis, who's not here tonight, suggested a course on catechesis. Now it's interesting because I'm teaching catechesis for the Chicago School. So, but it would basically be a review of theology. How to be a catechist. What do you need to know? What do you need to be able to do to catechize people? So, does that sound interesting?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
it
does. Very.
Yeah, and it would be a very kind of a little more detailed theological.
Oh, yeah.
It's not so much historical, but much more dogmatic theology.
Yeah, Deacon Patrick gave us kind of a intro
Okay.
thing, but it was almost kind of trying to develop the curriculum. It wasn't formalized.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
we met for several weeks.
Okay. Well, there is a catechesis that's just been published by the Moscow Patriarchate, but it's not in English yet. So, actually, it was written by Metropolitan Hilarion, so Alfeo. So, I don't have the wherewithal to translate a 300-page or 200-page book. That's too much. But it's eventually that'll be an excellent resource. So, okay. It is truly meet to bless the Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave his birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever into ages of ages.
Amen.
He's
belong to you.
Despota.